The court of King Henry VIII was a world of dazzling splendor and lethal paranoia. It was a place of magnificent feasts and public executions, of soaring ambition and sudden, terrifying falls from grace. To survive here required more than just noble birth or clever conversation. It required a sixth sense, an almost supernatural ability to read the subtle shifts in the king's mood, to know when to speak and when to disappear into the tapestries, to understand that the person you flattered today could be the person you were ordered to condemn tomorrow. And in this treacherous world, few played the game with more skill than a young woman named Jane Parker. For nearly 2 decades, she navigated the deadly currents of the Tudor court, adapting, observing, and surviving while queens and dynasties rose and fell around her. She was a master of the game. But what happens when the very skills that keep you alive make you the most dangerous person in the kingdom? What happens when you know too much? Jane was born into a world where a woman's power was a reflection of the men she was connected to. Her father was a respected courtier, and her education was unusually fine for a woman of her time. But her destiny was truly sealed around 1524, when she was married to a charismatic and ambitious young man, George Boleyn. This union thrust her directly into the heart of a family that was about to rewrite English history. Her sister-in-law as the captivating Anne Boleyn, the woman for whom Henry VIII would defy the Pope and break with the Roman Catholic Church. As the Boleyns ascended, so did Jane. Her husband George became one of the king's closest companions, a leading voice in the new Protestant Reformation, and a powerful figure at court. Jane, now known as Lady Rochford, took her place as a lady-in-waiting to the new Queen Anne. This position was far more than just ceremonial service. The ladies-in-waiting were the keepers of the Queen's most intimate world. They saw the tears behind the public smiles, heard the whispered arguments in the royal bedchamber, and understood the fragile reality of a royal marriage. They were expected to be invisible, yet indispensable, loyal, yet always aware of who held the true power. Jane excelled in this environment. Contemporaries noted her sharp intelligence and her uncanny ability to position herself advantageously. She understood that at Henry's court, knowledge was the ultimate currency, but it was also a currency that could get you executed. For a time, the Boleyns seemed untouchable, and was Queen. George was the king's favorite, and their family had reshaped the spiritual and political landscape of England. Jane was at the epicenter of this new world, a silent observer to a passionate and increasingly volatile royal marriage. But in the court of Henry VIII, the sun that warmed you one day could burn you the next. By 1536, the king's passion for Anne had curdled into frustration. She had failed to give him what he desired most, a male heir. His eye had begun to wander to a quiet, demure lady-in-waiting named Jane Seymour. The political winds, which Jane had learned to read so well, were shifting with terrifying speed. Suddenly, the king who had moved heaven and earth to marry Anne Boleyn was looking for a way out. And in Henry's world, the exit was often the executioner's block. In May of 1536, the storm broke. The unthinkable happened. Queen Anne Boleyn was arrested, accused of adultery with multiple men, including her own brother, George. The charges were shocking, designed to not only remove her, but to utterly destroy her reputation. The entire Boleyn faction, once the most powerful in England, was on the verge of collapse, and in the center of this firestorm was Jane, Lady Rochford. She was brought in for questioning. The king's ruthless minister, Thomas Cromwell, was building a case, and he needed testimony. He needed witnesses. Jane was now faced with a choice that defied imagination. Before her stood two paths, both leading to a kind of ruin. She could remain loyal to her family, deny the charges against her husband and sister-in-law, and almost certainly be condemned alongside them as a traitor. Or she could tell Cromwell what he wanted to hear. She could provide the details, the whispers, the observations that could be twisted into proof of guilt. She could save herself, but at the cost of her family. What did she do? What did she say in that dark room, with her life hanging in the balance? This was the moment that would define her life. and her death. It was the moment Jane Rochford, the ultimate survivor, became the keeper of the king's most dangerous secret, a secret that, years later, he would be willing to change the law itself to protect. What Jane said in that interrogation room remains one of the great, dark mysteries of the Tudor court. The historical records are deliberately vague, but the outcome was brutally clear. Her testimony, whatever it was, helped to seal the fate of her husband and her sister-in-law. George and Anne Boleyn were condemned for high treason. Their lives came to an end on Tower Hill, leaving Anne's infant daughter, the future Queen Elizabeth I, motherless. The Boleyn star had been extinguished as quickly as it had risen, and from the ashes, Jane, Lady Rochford, emerged, a survivor. But how does one survive such a thing? She was now a widow, her name forever tainted by the greatest royal scandal of the age. Most people in her position would have been banished, forced into a quiet, impoverished exile. But not Jane. In a move that reveals his chilling pragmatism, King Henry VIII kept her at court. Why? Because Jane now possessed something he valued immensely: knowledge. She was one of the few people alive who knew the intimate truth of his life with Anne Boleyn. She had seen his passion, his frustration, his rages. She knew the reality behind the public facade. To the king, she was a living archive of his own past, and he preferred to keep such archives close, where he could watch them. So Jane began her second life. She had to reinvent herself completely. She served the new queen, the gentle Jane Seymour, with flawless loyalty. She faded into the background, her face a mask of quiet competence. She buried her grief, her guilt, and her memories, becoming the perfect lady-in-waiting. When Jane Seymour passed away, giving Henry his long-awaited son, Jane Rochford survived the transition. When the German Princess Anne of Cleves was brought to England for a disastrously short marriage, Jane was there, a silent, watchful presence. With each passing year, with each new queen, the weight of her knowledge grew. She knew where all the skeletons were buried, because she had watched the king bury them. This made her invaluable, and it made her dangerous. Then, in 1540, the aging king's eye fell upon a new young woman, a vivacious, beautiful, and tragically naive girl, Katherine Howard. She was a niece of the powerful Duke of Norfolk, and completely unprepared for the viper's nest she was about to enter. When Henry made her his fifth wife, he once again turned to the most experienced lady-in-waiting in the kingdom to guide his young queen, Jane, Lady Rochford. She was now in her mid-30s, a veteran of court politics, a woman who had seen everything. She was placed at the very heart of yet another royal marriage, tasked with serving and protecting a queen who had no idea of the dangers that surrounded her. For Jane, this was the ultimate test of her survival skills. She had to win the trust of a new, young mistress. But she quickly discovered that Queen Catherine had a secret, a reckless, dangerous secret. Before her marriage, she had been involved with other men, and now, as Queen of England, she still possessed a passionate and foolish heart. She had become infatuated with one of the king's favorite courtiers, a handsome man named Thomas Culpeper. Catherine began seeking out secret meetings with him, a game of whispered messages and stolen moments that, if discovered, would mean a gruesome end for everyone involved. Jane was now faced with her second impossible choice. Does she warn the king, betraying the young queen who trusted her? Or does she help the queen, making herself indispensable, but also an accomplice to treason? Drawing on to decades of experience in court intrigue, Jane made a calculated decision. She would help the queen. She began to facilitate the secret meetings, acting as a go-between, a lookout, and a confidant. She arranged for Culpeper to be brought to the Queen's chambers late at night, using her knowledge of the palace corridors and staff schedules to cover their tracks. Why did she do it? Was it a strange form of loyalty to her mistress? Was she addicted to the thrill of the secret, the power of being the keeper of the flame? Or was it a fatal miscalculation? Did this master of survival, after years of playing the game perfectly, finally believe she was untouchable, that she could control the outcome of this dangerous affair? The secret meetings continued 4 months. Jane, the ultimate puppet master, pulled the strings, managing the most dangerous liaison in the kingdom. But secrets have a way of escaping in the court of Henry VIII, and this one was about to explode, bringing the entire world crashing down on Jane Rochford and dragging her back to the one place she must have prayed she would never see again, the Tower of London. The discovery came in late 1541, an anonymous letter, a whispered accusation to a trusted council member, and suddenly the king's fragile fantasy of a pure young bride was shattered. The investigation into Queen Katherine Howard's conduct was swift and merciless. Her past romantic entanglements were dredged up, and under interrogation, witnesses began to speak of her present indiscretions. They spoke of secret meetings, of a favoured courtier, and of the one person who made it all possible, Lady Rochford. The king's reaction was not one of sadness, but of volcanic rage. This was the second time a wife had betrayed him, a public humiliation he could not endure. His vengeance would be absolute. Jane's arrest was sudden. There was no warning, no chance to prepare. One moment, she was the Queen's most trusted lady in waiting, the next, she was a prisoner, being escorted by armed guards to a barge on the Thames. Her destination was the Tower of London. As the stone fortress grew larger on the horizon, a cold, familiar dread must have consumed her. This was the place where she had last seen her husband, George, the place where Anne Boleyn had met her end. It was a place of ghosts, and she was being sent to join them. The charges against her were for misprision of treason, the crime of concealing treasonous acts by facilitating the meetings between Katherine Howard and Thomas Culpeper. She was legally considered as guilty as they were. There would be no escape, and in that cold, damp cell, something inside Jane Rochford finally broke. The formidable mind, which had navigated the most dangerous court in Europe for 2 decades, collapsed under the weight of its own history. The trauma of her past, the trial, the executions, the years of suppressed guilt collided with the terror of her present. She was trapped in the same nightmare all over again. Her captors, hardened men accustomed to the grim realities of the Tower, were alarmed by what they saw. Within days of her imprisonment, Jane began to exhibit signs of a severe mental breakdown. Contemporary accounts, including a report from the Spanish ambassador, describe a woman completely detached from reality. She fell into what he called a fit of madness, speaking incoherently, laughing at inappropriate moments, and seeming to relive events from her past. She could not comprehend the charges against her. She did not seem to understand where she was. The psychological torment of returning to the site of her family's destruction had pushed her mind beyond its breaking point. She was, for all intents and purposes, insane. The news of her condition was delivered to King Henry's council, and this is where the story takes its most sinister turn. For over 200 years, English common law had held a sacred principle. It was illegal to execute a person who was not of sound mind. This wasn't just a legal technicality, it was a fundamental tenet of Christian mercy and civilized justice. A person had to be able to understand their crime and prepare their soul for God. Jane's madness, which should have been her salvation, had made her legally untouchable. The King's Council informed him that, as long as she remained in this state, her execution could not proceed. The law was clear. The woman who held the key to some of his darkest secrets, the last living witness to the fall of the Boleyns, was now shielded from his wrath by her own insanity. Henry VIII, a king who bent the will of popes and parliaments, was being thwarted by the broken mind of a single woman, and he would not stand for it. The rage of a king is a terrifying force, but the rage of a king who feels legally impotent is a force that can shatter the foundations of a nation. Henry VIII was faced with an ancient law, a principle of mercy that had stood for centuries. His response was not to respect it, but to obliterate it. If the law stood in the way of his vengeance, then the law itself would have to be broken. He put the full weight of his royal authority on his parliament, with a demand that was as simple as it was monstrous: change the law, and do it now. What followed was one of the most cynical and terrifying acts of legal manipulation in English history. In February 1542, Parliament was pressured to pass a new Act of Attainder. This was not unusual in itself. Such acts were often used to condemn traitors without a full trial. But this act contained a revolutionary new clause. It stated, in cold, clear language, that no person convicted of high treason should be exempted from execution by reason of any madness or lunacy. The law was being rewritten for a single purpose: to end the life of one mentally ill woman. It was a piece of legislation crafted with the specific aim of destroying Jane Rochford, making it arguably the most personally vindictive law ever passed by an English parliament. The speed with which it was done was breathtaking. In less than 2 weeks, centuries of legal and moral precedent were swept away. The members of Parliament, many of whom were privately horrified, understood the political reality. To oppose the King's will on this matter was to risk being accused of treason themselves. They rubber-stamped the act, and with the scratch of a royal pen, Henry VIII had his wish. Insanity was no longer a shield. Justice was now whatever the King said it was. The path to Jane's execution was clear. On the morning of February 13th, 1542, something remarkable happened. Witnesses reported that Jane, after months of incoherence, experienced a sudden and profound return to lucidity. The fog of her madness seemed to lift, allowing her to comprehend her situation with a calm and dignified clarity. Whether it was a brief respite from her illness or a final moment of grace, it allowed her to face her end not as a mad woman, but as the noble lady she had once been. She was dressed in a gown appropriate for her station and led out onto Tower Green. It was the exact same spot where, nearly 6 years earlier, her sister-in-law, Queen Anne Boleyn, had been executed. The grim irony of her fate was now complete. The ultimate survivor was to meet her end in the same place as the family she was accused of betraying. Before the small crowd of official observers, Jane delivered her final speech. It was the traditional speech of a condemned traitor. She admitted her guilt, asked for the King's forgiveness, and prayed for his prosperity. Her words were clear, her voice steady. It was an astonishing performance for a woman who, just days before, could not hold a rational conversation. And then, with professional efficiency, the headsman's axe fell. Her ordeal was over. She was buried in the Tower's chapel, laid to rest near the graves of Anne and George Boleyn. A grim family reunion in death. The execution of Jane Rochford sent a new, colder wave of fear through the English court. It was a clear and brutal message. There was no escape from the King's wrath. Not law, not tradition, not even madness could save you if you knew too much. The precedent set by her passing had chilling implications. It established that the most vulnerable members of society were not safe, as they became inconvenient to the state. Internationally, it cemented Henry's reputation as a tyrant, a king who would sacrifice any principle of justice for personal revenge. So why go to such extraordinary lengths to ensure the passing of one broken woman? Was it merely for her role in Katherine Howard's affair? Unlikely. Others involved faced their fate without the need to rewrite the nation's laws. The answer must lie deeper, in the secret she carried for 6 long years. Jane Rochford was the last living witness from the inner circle who saw the real story of Henry's transition from the passionate lover of Anne Boleyn to her ruthless destroyer. She knew the truth of his desperation for an heir, the intimacy of their arguments, the reality of his wandering eye. She knew that the official charges against Anne were a convenient fiction, and that knowledge, locked inside a mind that was now unstable and unpredictable, was the greatest threat of all. He didn't just want to end her life, he wanted to silence the ghost of his own past. In the end, Jane's story is the ultimate Tudor tragedy. It's a story about survival and its unbearable cost. We may never know if she was a cold-hearted betrayer or a victim of impossible choices, but her life and her uniquely cruel end serve as a timeless and terrifying reminder. It shows how absolute power corrupts not just individuals, but the very laws designed to protect them. And it proves that in a world governed by a tyrant, the most dangerous thing is the truth. The execution of Jane Boleyn, Lady Rochford, was not merely the end of a life, it was a profound violation of principle. In the annals of Henry VIII's reign, a period already stained by countless executions, her case stands apart. It represents a moment when the king's personal vendetta and paranoia became so absolute that he was willing to dismantle a cornerstone of English justice, a tradition of mercy that had protected the mentally vulnerable for generations. The Act of Parliament, passed with such chilling speed, was more than a law. It was a declaration that in Henry's England there was no sanctuary from the king's will. The silence that followed her passing is telling. Unlike other high-profile executions that generated ballads, pamphlets, and public discussion, Jane's end was met with a quiet, uncomfortable unease. It seemed even the most hardened supporters of the king were disturbed by the precedent. They had witnessed the law itself be twisted into a weapon, not to serve justice, but to serve one man's desire to erase an inconvenient witness. This act revealed the complete erosion of institutional independence. Parliament, the courts, the very concept of legal protection, all had been shown to be mere instruments of royal power. Looking back, the destruction of the Boleyn family unfolds like a multi-act tragedy, and Jane was its final victim. What began with the swift removal of Anne and George in 1536 was not truly complete until Jane's end in 1542. Her survival for those 6 intervening years was not a sign of the king's forgiveness, but merely a stay of execution. As long as she lived, a piece of his most controversial history remained outside of his control, a living repository of secrets he could not afford to have revealed, especially by a mind that was becoming increasingly fragile and unpredictable. Her execution completed a campaign of vengeance that spanned years, demonstrating the king's long memory and his terrifying patience in pursuit of total control over his own narrative. The legacy of this single execution will rule through English society and beyond. For the court, it was a final, brutal lesson. There was no limit to the king's vindictiveness. It fostered an even deeper culture of fear, where courtiers understood that literally nothing could shield them from royal displeasure. For legal scholars and European diplomats, it was definitive proof of Henry VIII's tyranny, further isolating England and reinforcing its reputation as a place of barbarism. The theological implications also troubled the clergy. To end the life of someone unable to make a final confession was to potentially condemn their soul, an act that placed the king in opposition to fundamental Christian doctrine. Ultimately, Jane's story is a profound cautionary tale about the nature of power and the price of dangerous knowledge. Her life illustrates the particular vulnerability of women in a patriarchal court, where their proximity to power and their knowledge of intimate secrets made them uniquely threatening. The systematic elimination of the women who knew too much, Anne Boleyn, Katherine Howard, and finally Jane herself, reveals a specific paranoia in Henry's character. He could not tolerate female witnesses to his perceived weaknesses. While history may never offer a final verdict on Jane's character, whether she was a calculating betrayer or a tragic victim, her fate transcends her personal choices. She became a symbol of a corrupted system, a testament to the fact that in the face of unchecked authoritarianism, even madness offers no protection. Her execution remains one of the darkest stains on the Tudor legacy, a moment when justice didn't just fail, it was actively dismantled. The execution of Jane Boleyn, Lady Rochford, on that cold February morning in 1542, represents more than just another entry in the long list of Henry VIII's victims. It marks a watershed moment, a point of no return in the corrosion of a kingdom's soul. To end her life, the king had to wage war not on a foreign power, but on his own country's laws, on centuries of tradition, and on the basic principles of human decency. In sacrificing the legal and moral protections for society's most vulnerable, Henry revealed the terrifying, limitless nature of his own paranoia. He demonstrated that no principle, no matter how sacred, was more important than his personal desire for absolute control. Her story is a chilling case study in how quickly the structures of a civilized society can be dismantled by authoritarian pressure. The image of the English Parliament, cowed into submission and rewriting fundamental law to satisfy the vengeful whim of one man, serves as an eternal warning. It shows that justice is not an abstract concept, but a fragile agreement, easily broken when institutions lack the courage to resist. This single act had consequences that would echo for generations, leaving a permanent scar on the English legal system. The psychological horror of Jane's final months adds a layer of profound tragedy to the tale. Her descent into madness within the grim walls of the Tower was not a ploy, but the genuine collapse of a mind crushed by unbearable trauma. The king's refusal to acknowledge her suffering, his interpretation of it as a mere obstacle to his plans, reveals a cruelty that transcends political calculation. It is the cruelty of a man who has lost all capacity for empathy, who sees other human beings only as pawns or threats in the grand game of his own ego. Perhaps the greatest tragedy of all is that her execution achieved nothing of substance. It silenced one woman, but at the cost of cementing the king's reputation as a tyrant. It erased a keeper of secrets, but established legal precedents that would haunt his kingdom long after his own passing. The supreme irony of her fate, a master of survival, destroyed by the very skills and knowledge that had kept her alive for so long, gives her story the quality of a dark fable. She navigated the most treacherous waters imaginable for nearly 2 decades, only to be consumed by a wave of her own making. In the end, the execution of Jane Boleyn stands as one of the most morally indefensible acts of Henry VIII's reign. It is a story that forces us to look beyond the pageantry of the Tudor court and into the dark heart of unchecked power. It reminds us that civilization is a thin veneer, easily stripped away when a ruler decides that law is merely a tool and mercy is a weakness. Her death is a permanent stain on a king's legacy, and a timeless, sobering reminder that when power is allowed to operate without constraint, no one is safe, not even from themselves. The story of Jane Boleyn, Lady Rochford, is a stark reminder that history is not just a record of kings and battles, but of the human lives caught in the gears of power. Her tragedy reveals the terrifying fragility of justice and the devastating price of secrets. There are countless such stories hidden in the archives, moments when a single life or a single decision in the course of a nation. To uncover more of these forgotten histories and understand the forces that shaped our world, subscribe to our channel and join us on our next journey into the past.